Hi Misha, how's your life in Brooklyn?
Well, I would say, like a jazz solo, vibrant, chaotic, and endlessly entertaining. And how is your life in Northern California? Are you still enjoying your adaptogenic mushroom coffee?
Transcendentally creative, thank you. But this is a jazz podcast, not a fungi infomercial, so let's get to work.
So what will we be talking about today, Dad?
What if I told you one of the most innovative Polish jazz albums of all time started with musicians openly admitting they were just pretending to know what they were doing? Today, we're exploring how a group of Polish artists turned faking it into genuine musical genius. We're talking about Poland in the early 1970s, behind the Iron Curtain, where Zbigniew Namysłowski and his quintet recorded Winobranie album in 1973. To quote Namysłowski from his 1994 Jazz Forums interview, "None of us really knew how to navigate free jazz back then, so we were all just faking it. It wasn't until these pieces came together that constructing free jazz solos became easier."
That's such a refreshing way to look at artistic innovation. The honesty behind that admission really changes how we view the creative process.
You know what makes this even more fascinating? While they started by pretending, they ended up creating something entirely authentic.
The historical context really adds another layer to this story. How did they manage to create such experimental music under those conditions?
Well, that's where it gets interesting. By the early 1970s, Polish jazz had matured beyond its post-bop roots, embracing free jazz, fusion, and global influences. Artists like Komeda, Tomasz Tanko, and Michael Urbaniak had already been gaining some international acclaim, but Namysłowski was the first to carve a distinct path with his genre-blurring approach. After several years recording gap after his kinda traditional bebop albums in the 1960s, including Lola on Decca Records, Namysłowski emerged with these incredibly innovative ideas. He was using an electrified cello with wah-wah effects, prepared piano to mimic Indian instruments, and complex time signatures that nobody in Polish jazz had attempted before.
Those sound like pretty radical choices for 1973.
Those were radical choices for 1973, yet not entirely surprising. The year Winobranie was released, Poland simmered as a pressure cooker of creativity, social flux, and political tension. Caught between fading state repression and the consumer socialism of new communist leader Edward Gierek, the country embodied contradictions. Gierek's regime, which has taken power in late 1970 after worker protests, borrowed heavily from the West to modernize industry, creating a fleeting illusion of prosperity. I remember how it felt, watching favorite TV shows in color for the first time, buying Wrangler jeans, sipping Coca-Cola. Small luxuries masking deeper economic fragility. And let's not forget Poland's football glory during this era. At the 1972 Munich Olympics, we claimed gold, then followed up in 1973 by holding England to a draw. A result that secured our spot in the 1974 World Cup, where we went on to win bronze. What a time for Polish football.
Oh, stop it, Dad. Come on. I know you hate soccer, so don't even pretend to care about it. Nice try, Dad, but we both know you couldn't care less about soccer.
Oh well, what I mean is this. The early 1970s were a time of transformation. Poland remained a Soviet satellite, but art, especially jazz, became a coded language of freedom. Less overtly political than the punk that would follow, it was every bit as rebellious through its artistry.
So how did audiences respond to such new radical approaches?
Here's the thing, they loved it. Namysłowski was the first to carve a distinct path with his genre-blurring approach. When his quintet debuted at Jazz Jamboree in the fall of 1972, it was immediately recognized as something special. The way they balanced traditional Polish folk elements with free jazz experimentation was unlike anything people had heard before.
That reminds me, didn't a prominent American critic have something significant to say about one of the tracks?
Yes, Willis Conover said their track Taj Mahal was the most convincing emulation of Indian classical music he'd ever heard in jazz. And remember, they achieved this without any traditional Indian instruments, just a clever use of Western instruments, mostly an electrically amplified cello and using piano in unconventional ways.
So Namysłowski was essentially creating world music fusion before that was even a recognized genre.
Exactly, and what's remarkable is how he structured the entire album as a cohesive suite. The title track, Winobranie, which means wine harvest, uses this traditional Polish folk dance called a kujawiak, but then transforms it through these complex time signatures. We're talking 11/8 and 7/8 rhythms.
That must have required some incredibly skilled musicians to pull off. Who else was in the band?
The lineup was stellar. The leader on alto saxophone, cello, flute, and electric piano, Tomasz Szukalski; on tenor sax, shifting between lyrical phrasing and fiery outbursts, Stanisław Cieślak; on growling trombone, adding that avant-garde grit, Paweł Jarzemski on bass and percussion, and great Kazimierz Jąkisz on drums. But what's fascinating is how democratic their approach was. This wasn't just Namysłowski's show.
That collaborative spirit really seems key to what made this album special. How did they approach the free jazz elements?
Well, unlike American free jazz, which often embraced chaos, they maintained this incredible sense of structure even in their most experimental moments. It's like they found this perfect balance between freedom and form, while openly admitting they were figuring it out as they went along.
That balance between structure and freedom seems like it would be incredibly difficult to achieve.
You know what's interesting? The album came out as the 33rd installment in the prestigious Polish jazz series, but it sounded nothing like the previous 32nd volume. Just listen to that. That was My Little Christine by Sami Swoi from Circus' 32nd album of Polish jazz series. I personally like Dixieland jazz, but come on, we are talking about 1970s music here. And now listen to Namysłowski Quintet on volume 33. They were literally creating a new language for Polish jazz in real time.
But doesn't it sound a little bit like Mahavishnu Orchestra?
Yeah, I'm sure Namysłowski must have listened to McLaughlin, Chick Corea, the Art Ensemble of Chicago, and probably Zappa, all the acts dominating the jazz scene in 1973. But what set him apart was his uniquely Polish fusion, folk traditions woven into structured freedom and instrumental innovation. His folk influences weren't just stylistic adornments, they were deeply localized and compositional, a Slavic reimagining of jazz vocabulary. And that cello of his, to me, utterly psychedelic, bridging tradition with rebellion. Even the odd meters, 7/8, 11/8, felt organic, never clinical. As critic Stuart Nicholson noted, Polish jazz didn't follow trends, it sidestepped them to invent its own.
Looking back now, what do you think is the most significant legacy of this album?
I think its greatest legacy is showing that innovation doesn't require pretending to have all the answers. They took this amazing leap into the unknown, combining Polish folk music, free jazz, and Indian classical influences, all while maintaining this infectious sense of joy throughout.
That's such a powerful message about artistic creation and innovation.
And here's what's truly remarkable. The album sounds as fresh today as it did in 1973. It's like they weren't just ahead of their time, they were creating something timeless. Sometimes the most profound innovations come from being willing to admit what you don't know and then forging ahead anyway.
That really challenges our assumptions about expertise and innovation, doesn't it?
Absolutely right. And I think that's why this album deserves so much more recognition. It's not just a historical curiosity or an interesting experiment. It's a masterpiece that shows how being honest about our limitations can sometimes lead to the most groundbreaking achievements.
Thanks for tuning in. If you enjoyed today's episode, be sure to follow us on your favorite podcast platform to never miss an update. We're available on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Amazon, YouTube, and wherever else you get your podcasts. This podcast was produced by Cezary L. Lurski and PolishJazz.com. The picture of Zbigniew Namysłowski Quintet by Marek Karowicz. All rights to the music and album artwork used in today's episode belong exclusively to Polskie Nagrania and Warner Music Group. All rights reserved.